All right, let's dive in. Today, we're stepping into a world of crumbling castles, flickering candlelight, and secrets buried deep within stone walls. We are pulling back the heavy, velvet curtain on Gothic fiction, a genre that's built not just on a story, but on pure, chilling atmosphere. Let's figure out what makes it so creepy and so timeless.
I know. It sounds like a weird mix, right? A spooky building, a tragic monster, a creature of the night, but they all actually spring from the exact same dark, imaginative soil. They belong to this single, incredibly influential literary tradition that we are about to unpack together.
Okay, so first things first. Before we can explore the haunted hallways, we have to ask the most fundamental question. What is Gothic fiction, really? Let's lay the cornerstone for this whole thing.
At its heart, this is it. It's less about a specific kind of plot and way more about, as it says here, an aesthetic of fear. And that last part? The intrusion of the past upon the present. That's absolutely key. Gothic stories are obsessed with the idea that old secrets, ancient sins, and forgotten traumas, well, they don't stay buried for long.
You know, what's really wild is where the name even comes from. Gothic was not a compliment. Not at all. It was basically an insult people in the Renaissance threw at the Middle Ages and its pointy arched architecture to call it barbaric and crude. So what did the founders of this genre do? They took that insult and wore it like a badge of honor. And here's where it all kicks off. The whole fascination actually started with architecture. You had people building fake ruins in their gardens just to capture that feeling of history and decay. Then, in 1764, this guy, Horace Walpole, he basically took that architectural mood and bottled it. He published The Castle of Otranto, slapped the subtitle A Gothic Story on it, and bam, a literary genre was born.
So, say you wanted to write your own Gothic story. What's the recipe? What are the must-have ingredients to create that signature sense of terror? Let's look at the essential building blocks.
Here is your checklist for pure dread. First, you need that claustrophobic atmosphere, almost always centered on a crumbling old building. Then, you gotta populate it with ghosts or some other supernatural threat, stir in some deep, dark family secrets, and add the constant nagging fear of being trapped, or worse, buried alive. Every single one of these elements is working toward one goal, to make you feel totally alone and completely unsafe.
And hey, if you've ever picked up one of these books and thought, wow, this plot is all over the place, well, that's on purpose. The stories are often a maze of discovered letters, tales told by different people, and timelines that jump all around. This isn't sloppy writing. It's a very deliberate trick to build suspense and make you, the reader, feel just as confused and trapped as the characters.
Now, we keep talking about these ruined buildings, right? But here's the thing. They're not just a spooky backdrop. No way. In Gothic fiction, the architecture itself is practically a main character.
And this quote just nails the whole philosophy. This genre, and the Gothic revival architecture it's tied to, was a rebellion. It was a giant pushback against the calm, rational, scientific thinking of the Enlightenment. It was all about embracing intense emotions, the thrill of being scared, the awe of seeing something overwhelming, even the joy of being terrified.
So, how does a building actually do all this heavy lifting in the story? Well, it works in a few key ways. First, the ruins are a physical symbol of the past weighing down the present. Second, their remote locations cut characters off from the world, creating total isolation. Third, their huge, crumbling scale makes you feel both small and scared. And finally, and this is the coolest part, the building's layout literally mirrors the plot. In the Castle of Otranto, the secret passages in the castle directly reflect the hidden family secrets about who should rightfully own it. So, from that one haunted castle, the Gothic genre just took off. It evolved like crazy over the centuries and ended up influencing some of the most famous characters and authors in all of literature.
I mean, just look at this family tree. The genre grows from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to the haunting tales of Poe and the Bronte sisters. It gives us the vampire we all know and love, or fear, in Dracula. And then, with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it does something amazing. It turns inward. The horror is no longer just in the castle, it's inside the human mind. And of course, that legacy is still going strong today with modern masters of horror and suspense. And this right here is the secret sauce. This is why the genre has lasted so long. It's almost never just about a ghost or a monster. These horrifying events are powerful metaphors. They're a way to talk about our deepest psychological fears or the anxieties bubbling up under the surface of society. The monster is always standing in for something else.
Which brings us to our final thought here.
You see, the crumbling castles and the vengeful ghosts, they were really just the beginning. The true territory that the Gothic wants to explore is much, much closer to home.
Ultimately, what the genre teaches us is that the most terrifying haunted house isn't made of stone and wood. It's the human mind. The secrets we keep, the guilt we carry, the past that just refuses to stay buried. That's the real haunting. The monsters have changed over the centuries, sure, but that core exploration of our own inner darkness, that's as relevant today as it ever was. Which leaves us with a question. What are the modern ghosts that haunt our stories now?
You know that feeling, right? That perfect mix of wonder and just a little bit of terror. If you've ever gotten lost in a spooky story about a haunted castle or an ancient curse, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That is the Gothic. But how did this whole tradition, this perfect blend of awe and dread, even happen? Okay, let's get into it.
Yeah, this was no accident. Think of the Gothic like a really complex and carefully crafted recipe. All the right ingredients had to come together at exactly the right time in history. So, in this explainer, we're going to pull back the curtain and actually find that recipe. We're going to figure out the essential ingredients that gave us Dracula, Frankenstein, and a literary tradition that, let's be honest, still gets under our skin today.
All right, so first up, our first ingredient, it's not what you think. It's not a book, not an author. Nope, it's a feeling. A space that just kind of opened up in everyone's mind, Like this big, empty psychological void that was just begging for something new and mysterious to fill it.
This says it all, doesn't it? For centuries, all the mystery, all the scary stuff, it was out there, on the edges of the map. Here be dragons, right? But then, bam, the 18th century hits. The age of exploration is in full swing, and we're filling in all those blank spots. And guess what? No dragons. The world was suddenly known, cataloged. And honestly, kind of boring. We needed a new place to put our dragons, a whole new frontier for the unknown. And look at this, it was the absolute perfect storm. I mean, everything was happening at once. You've got the maps filling in, so the physical world is losing its mystery, but at the same time, you've got this fresh memory of massive political chaos, like the Jacobite Rising. I mean, old power structures were being torn down, leaving this cultural ghost behind. And then, on top of all that, brand new ideas about how emotions even work are bubbling up. It's all just simmering, waiting for that first Gothic novel to drop in 1764.
Okay, so you need a new home for your ghosts and mysteries, right? Where do you go? You go to the past, of course. And the thing is, 18th century Britain was obsessed, and I mean totally obsessed, with this dreamy romantic version of the Middle Ages. People were literally building fake Gothic ruins in their backyards. This meant that when the first Gothic writers showed up, the stage was already set. The crumbling castles, the spooky forests, they were already there, perfectly furnished inside everyone's imagination.
All right, so we've got the cultural need for mystery. Check. We've got the perfect medieval backdrop. Check. But what about the vibe? The darkness, the gloom, all that focus on death and decay? Well, for our second ingredient, turns out that was already lying around too.
Yeah, the Gothic writers didn't just invent all this gloom and doom from scratch. They were smart. They were borrowing from what was already popular. You had this whole group called the graveyard poets who were obsessed with, you guessed it, graveyards and death. You had folks like Daniel Defoe writing these incredibly grim descriptions of the plague. It was all there. The Gothic just came along, gathered up all that darkness, and cranked the volume up to 11.
Okay, let's pause and see what we've got. Ingredient 1, a culture hungry for mystery. Ingredient 2, these awesome medieval settings. Ingredient 3, a dark, morbid mood that's already popular. All the parts are right there on the table. But here's the thing. If you just mash them all together, it's not quite Gothic. Something's missing. There's a secret ingredient, a binder that holds it all together. So, what is it? And this is it. The final piece of the puzzle. The most important ingredient of them all. And it wasn't another spooky element for a story. It was an entire philosophy, a whole new way of thinking that took all those random parts and fused them into something powerful, something new. The guy who gave us the secret ingredient was a philosopher named Edmund Burke. And get this, in 1757, way before anyone had even written a Gothic novel, he publishes this book. And it's basically the instruction manual. It's the blueprint for how to create the exact feeling that would define the entire Gothic genre. He literally wrote the rules of the game before the game even started.
And that special feeling, it had a name, the sublime. Now, when Burke talked about the sublime, he wasn't talking about a pretty sunset. No. This was an overwhelming, mind-blowing feeling of awe that pushed you to your absolute limits. He called it the strongest emotion a person could possibly feel. And that right there, that became the holy grail for every Gothic writer. That's the feeling they wanted to give you.
Okay, so how do you actually get to the sublime? Well, Burke laid out this brilliant little formula. Your goal is the sublime. The fastest way to get there? Terror. Pure terror. But, and this is the genius part, what makes terror really terrifying? Obscurity, the unknown. Burke basically said that if you see the monster clear as day, it's not that scary anymore. The real terror, the stuff that sticks with you, comes from the shadows. It comes from what you can't quite see, what you don't understand.
And that's why this was such a game changer. This idea gave the Gothic a backbone. Without it, these stories would have just been a jumbled mess of ghost stories and cheap shocks. But Burke's philosophy, this idea of sublime terror, it gave the whole genre a purpose. It gave it a structure. It turned it from sensationalist fluff into a real, lasting art form.
Okay, so let's put it all together. We found the recipe. We've seen how this totally unique mix of culture, history, and philosophy all had to come together at just the right moment to create something brand new. Something that, let's face it, we're still obsessed with today.
So, here it is, the recipe in a nutshell. You need 3 things. 1, a culture that's run out of mysteries on the map and is desperate for a new unknown. 2, a whole bunch of spooky, death-obsessed literature that's already lying around. And 3, the secret sauce, that philosophical idea of sublime terror, which is all about the power of what you can't see.
And that kind of leaves us with a huge question, doesn't it? I mean, our world is 1,000 times more mapped out and explained than the 18th century ever was. We have data on literally everything. So where do we find our sublime? Where do we find that awe and terror today? Is it in the blackness of deep space, the bottom of the ocean, the weirdness of AI? What happens when you think you finally run out of dragons on the map?
You know the drill. Haunted castles, those brooding, mysterious heroes, and all the things that go bump in the night. We all know the classic tropes of Gothic literature, but have you ever stopped and wondered where it all came from? It really wasn't just one single stroke of genius. It was more like a secret recipe with ingredients that had been simmering for over 100 years. So let's dive in and uncover this formula for fear. To get us in the right mood, just listen to these lines from Shakespeare's Hamlet. That feeling, right? That atmosphere of dread and darkness, that is the absolute essence of the Gothic. It's a mood that feels ancient and, deeply unsettling. So where did this all start? How do you even begin to assemble a genre that has captivated and terrified people for centuries? Well, that's the big question we're going to tackle in this explainer. We're going to break down the whole literary recipe, ingredient by ingredient. Now, most scholars will point you to this year, 1764. That's when Horace Walpole published The Castle of Otranto, which is widely considered the very first Gothic novel. But here's the really interesting part. Walpole wasn't just inventing this out of thin air. He was more like a master chef, combining all these amazing flavors that had been perfected long, long before him. Okay, so let's get to our first key ingredient, the bard himself, William Shakespeare. You have to remember these early Gothic writers were creating something totally new. And to give their work some weight, some legitimacy, they looked back to the master of English drama for inspiration. And this slide just perfectly lays out what they borrowed. I mean, think about it. The ghost in Hamlet, the creepy witches in Macbeth, all the dramatic murders and doomed lovers, and of course, those huge, looming medieval castles. Shakespeare basically provided the entire dramatic skeleton, the plots, the settings, the high emotional stakes that would become the absolute backbone of Gothic fiction.
All right, next up in our recipe, we need a villain. And not just any villain, a compelling villain. For this, Gothic authors turned to the great epic poet John Milton. And boy, did he deliver. He didn't just create a villain, he created an archetype that would be copied for centuries to come.
So in his 1667 masterpiece, Paradise Lost, Milton gave the world one of its most complex and, frankly, fascinating characters, Satan. But this was not your simple mustache-twirling baddie. No way. Milton's Satan was tragic. He was charismatic. He was rebellious. He was, for all intents and purposes, an anti-hero.
And this character? He became the direct blueprint for what we now call the Byronic hero. This is your classic Gothic leading man. Brooding, super intelligent, haunted by some secret sin from his past, but you can't help but be drawn to him. There's a direct line from Milton's Satan to characters like Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, and you could even argue all the way to Edward Cullen in Twilight. So Milton's big contribution was giving the Gothic its iconic, charismatic villain.
Okay, so we've got drama, we've got a villain. What's missing? The vibe, the atmosphere, that feeling of gloom and suppressed desire. For this final core ingredient, writers look to an 18th century poet named Alexander Pope.
This comes from Pope's hugely popular 1717 poem, Eloisa to Abelard. It's a tale of star-crossed lovers who are forced into religious seclusion, and it is just packed with the kind of emotional turmoil that became pure fuel for the Gothic genre.
And here's what later writers totally snatched from it. Pope perfected the use of gloomy imagery, that sense of religious terror, the agony of forbidden, suppressed passion, and the tragedy of lovers who are just doomed to be apart. He basically created the emotional weather, the whole mood of the Gothic novel.
So there we have it. All our ingredients are on the counter. We have the dramatic plots from Shakespeare, the charismatic anti-hero from Milton, and that gloomy, passionate atmosphere from Pope. Now it's time to see how it all comes together.
This table just sums it up perfectly, doesn't it? Shakespeare's ghosts and castles became our haunted castles and vengeful spirits. Milton's incredibly complex Satan gave us that iconic Byronic hero. And Pope's poetry gave us the template for the brooding atmosphere and all those stories of forbidden love. You can see how each piece was absolutely essential. And boom, just like that. With all these elements combined and brought together by authors like Horace Walpole, the foundation was set. The secret recipe for Gothic literature was finally complete, ready to be used to cook up terrifying and thrilling stories for generations and generations to come.
So the next time you watch a horror movie or read a dark fantasy novel, think about this recipe. You've got to ask yourself, how many of our modern ghost stories, our tormented heroes, and our atmospheric thrillers are still using these exact same ingredients, first mixed together more than 250 years ago? The shadows are long, and you know what? This recipe has never gone out of style. You know, some genres, they're not just stories, right? They're more like secret languages, designed to talk about things you're not supposed to talk about. They hide these huge, radical ideas right out in the open, just by wrapping them up in a really thrilling disguise. And today, we're going to decode one of the most fascinating of them all, the female Gothic. So picture this. It's the late 18th century. A woman is completely lost in a novel, totally captivated. But the second someone walks into the room, she slams it shut, acting all casual. Jane Austen actually wrote about this, about the momentary shame women felt reading these books. They were this private, thrilling pleasure, but also seen as a little improper, you know? And that tension, that's right at the heart of the female Gothic.
So what is the female Gothic exactly? Well, it grew out of that bigger Gothic movement with amazing authors like Anne Radcliffe and Mary Shelley leading the way. And it takes all those classic Gothic things we know and love, you know, the creepy castles, the dark woods, the secret hallways, and it uses them for something else entirely. It turns them into a stage to explore what was really haunting women back then, their place in society, their fears, and all of their hidden desires. And you can really see the split in the genre right here. On one side, you've got the male Gothic. That's usually about some powerful guy, like a mad scientist or a monster, just smashing social taboos. But the female Gothic? It flips the camera around completely. Now the story is all about a persecuted heroine. She's usually running from some controlling father figure and trying to figure out the secrets of her own family. And this is the absolute key. Why all the ghosts? Why the haunted houses? Well, because it gave women writers a secret way to talk about stuff that was totally forbidden in public. The ghost story was this brilliant disguise. I mean, you couldn't just write a book directly criticizing patriarchy, no way, but you could hide that exact same critique inside a spooky thriller and use a haunting as a metaphor for male violence and predatory behavior.
Okay, and here is the twist that these authors used, and it's just genius. It's this feature called the explained supernatural. So for half the novel, the heroine is absolutely terrified of what she thinks is a ghost, right? She's hearing chains rattle, seeing shadowy figures. But then, at the end, it turns out there's a perfectly logical explanation for everything. The rattling was just the wind. The ghost? Oh, that was just a servant trying to scare her.
Which, of course, leads us to the single most important question of this entire genre. If the ghosts and the monsters and all the huntings, if they're not even real, then what is the heroine really afraid of? What is the true horror in these stories?
And here's the answer. The horror isn't supernatural at all. It's human. The real terror comes from what one critic so powerfully called the disability of being female in that society. The real monsters weren't ghosts from the great beyond. They were the everyday societal horrors that women were facing. So what were these horrors? Well, the villain isn't some demon. It's a husband or a father or a guardian. The big threat isn't being haunted by a spirit. It's the very real, very terrifying danger of rape, incest, domestic abuse, or just the suffocating control of a man in her life. That's what all the supernatural stuff was really about. And the horror went even deeper than that. The genre was obsessed with this feeling of being trapped. That creepy castle or that locked room wasn't just a building. It was a symbol for the cages without bars that confined women. They were trapped in the home, trapped by the limits of their own bodies, and trapped by things like marriage and childbirth, which for many felt like a life sentence. Now, it's really easy to hear all this and just think these are stories about helpless victims. But that's not the full picture, not at all. The Female Gothic was also a place to explore women fighting back, and sometimes even rebelling completely. Not every heroine was just a damsel in distress. You basically see two main types of heroines. On one hand, you have that classic persecuted heroine from authors like Anne Radcliffe. She's good, she's naive, she's vulnerable. But then you have this totally radical other figure from authors like Charlotte Dacre. Her heroines are sexually assertive, they're aggressive, they go after what they want, and they just shatter every gender rule of the time. The way these novels are structured is also incredibly smart. A lot of them are basically coming-of-age stories. The plot follows the heroine's journey as she learns to tell the difference between what's a supernatural fantasy and what's a rational, real-world threat. So as she figures out the ghosts aren't real, she, and we, the readers right along with her, starts to understand the true nature of the danger she's in. And this brings us to the absolutely devastating realization that's at the core of the Female Gothic. The heroine's education, it's not about learning ghosts aren't real. It's about learning how power works. She learns that her true problem, her true plight, is her condition as a woman in a world that was built by and for men. The ultimate horror is the system itself. So really, when you boil it all down, the Female Gothic was so much more than just some spooky stories to read on a dark night. It was a vital, even subversive outlet. It gave women a language and a space to talk about their anxieties, their frustrations, and their deep unhappiness with a society that gave them almost no power and very few choices. And that leaves us with a pretty big question to think about, doesn't it? The Female Gothic used ghosts and horror to talk about the things people in their time were too scared to say out loud. So what about us? What are our modern ghost stories? What movies or books or genres are we using right now to explore the societal fears that we're still struggling to name?